This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Tamotu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. That's right, we are back on Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast about great trash and problematic faves, and we have not made a new episode in quite some time, for reasons too boring to go into, so I shall not. But this evening, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce you to Bitter Karella, a person I know from the internet, who I want to say, had a sort of micro-celebrity status as the Sinfest explainer for a little bit, which is a thing that we can perhaps get into. That was the thing that really made me follow you, because what I would like to talk to you about this evening is the webcomic explosion of the early 2000s, and Sinfest was absolutely part of that. And so, the reason that I kind of got locked into what you were doing on social media was because you were doing this Sinfest explainer bit. And this was this thing that I had read for a while and then dropped off of for reasons that I don't really remember. And hearing that he had gone completely insane in the meantime is, I don't know, it's like, discovering that a TV show that you loved as a kid had a third season or a fourth season that you never heard about, where it turned out that everyone was a Nazi and they were sacrificing children or something. It's that order of weirdness. But anyway, hello, Karella. How's it going?
It's going well. Thanks for having me. I am always excited to talk about Sinfest and the world of the 2000 webcomics, the year 2000 webcomics. God, I can't believe I'm the Sinfest whisperer now. That's the funniest thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to get stuck on Sinfest for the whole show, because I would, if people want to hear about that, I would thoroughly recommend the episode that you did with House of Decline about that. I had a listen to it. It's amazing, and it's incredibly thorough in a way that we probably don't have the time to do here. But Sinfest is a comic by a guy called Tatsuya Ishida. It's very much part of this explosion of webcomics that happened all at once in the early 2000s. And it features a ripoff of Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes, only he's a stereotypical cool guy who is also deeply insecure in a lot of ways. And it kind of distinguished itself by having way better art than everybody else, and also being consistently quite clever. And in the last, 5 years or so? Ishida has steadily got madder and madder and madder, starting with a kind of radical feminist turn and then pivoting into TERF stuff, and then just every conspiracy available by now, I think.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing because like you mentioned, Sinfest is one of the, I would say, one of the OG webcomics. It literally premiered in the year 2000, which is really when webcomics, I think, started flowering and blooming. That's when, there's some that predated in the 90s, but let's be honest, in the 90s, most people did not have internet. And if they did, it was mostly all either college students or weirdos, and there's some overlap in that.
My dad was was always kind of a tech early adopter. He's in his 70s now, so he's slowed down a wee bit on that. But we had a Commodore 64 when I was tiny. And he's kind of gone on from that. So we got the internet relatively early, but also dial-up internet from the late 90s, if you were doing anything with high-quality images involved, you were going to be waiting for like 5 minutes for every individual page to load in line by line by line by line.
Yep. Just beep, beep, beep,
yeah,
beep, just slowly things appearing. So because I remember being like a teenager on the internet in like 1998 is when we first got in my home, and so of course being a teen and like I have distinct memories of the early net, which was sneaking downstairs when everyone else is asleep and trying to find pornography on the internet, which was impossible because things would take like a half an hour, 45 minutes to load so you can see a nipple. And of course, back then the websites would be like, oh, click here to prove to show you're 18. And I was like, well, they'll know if I'm lying. Damn it. They're always ahead of me. But one thing that I could access as a teenager on the internet without having to lie was back then were GeoCities pages where you could download sound clips from Mystery Science Theater 3000 and webcomics. That was the other thing you could look at, which were like regular comics, but on the internet. And since anyone could put them on the internet, there's literally no barrier to entry. All you needed was like a scanner, and sometimes not even that, because a lot of them were just like pixel comics where you would just take video game sprites and put them on the page. So literally anyone could do it. So they were all terrible. They were all awful. But it was just a thrill seeing it on the internet. Like you could get entertainment from the computer. You didn't have to like go and buy a newspaper anymore, though you probably would want to, because
Yeah, I mean that was the thing that stood out about Sinfest, was that it looked like the way that he did jokes to start with, at least, and constructed strips. Like you could plausibly imagine, so long as he didn't get sued by Bill Watterson for ripping off the design, that he could have been syndicated in a newspaper. Like that was really unusual, as you say. Like it was a massive explosion of creativity, but like, I guess the early days of punk music, when there was a massive explosion of creativity, a lot of it was really shit.
Yeah. And the thing is, I say this with love because I think there's kind of an auteur charm to a lot of these comics. There were people who were, doing a labor of love. They wanted to express themselves. They wanted to put their creativity out there. And the tools that they had at their disposal were not adequate to actually have their vision realized. But what we get is like some really interesting things back then. Tetsuya Ishida of Sinfest was probably one of the first people who really thought that he could go professional with it, because he studied newspaper comics. You can see the influence of Calvin Hobbes and Bloom County in his own work. And he understood you do 4 panels. He understood clean line work, how to construct a joke. And so it was obviously made with the intention of eventually becoming syndicated and going into the newspaper, which a lot of early webcomics in 2000, sorry to ramble a bit.
Oh, no, this is entirely our thing. So like ramble away.
Yeah. Excellent. Because a lot of early webcomics, the idea, I think, was the goal was to become a syndicated newspaper comic strip. They were like, that was the pie in the sky ideal. A little bit later on, I think, as cartoonists started to realize, like, look, that is literally only how many syndicated web cartoonists are there in the newspaper? Not that many. It's an extremely difficult gig to get. It's kind of a pipe dream for most of us. They started finding ways to, build an audience exclusively online, and then monetize that either by selling T-shirts or ad space or even collections of books. But that was a little bit down the line from 2000. In 2000, the main thing was, if you're good enough, maybe like Hollywood will discover you. Like a talent scout from the newspaper will come by and be like, you got moxie, kid. You should be in the newspaper. The two that I think I've said this before, the two comics, when I was on forums in the year 2000, there were 2 web comics that everyone was convinced one of the 2 was going to be the first one to bust out of web comics and become an actual newspaper syndicated comic. One of them was Sinfest, and the other one was Ozzy and Millie. And I don't know if you're familiar with Ozzy and Millie.
No, Ozzy and Millie completely bypassed me.
Oh, okay. So Ozzy and Millie was a webcomic about it was a furry webcomic, which was, by the way, furry webcomics were their own entirely different ecosystem in those days. Furry webcomics had this ghetto that they stayed in. They never cross-pollinated with normal webcomics, except for this one. Ozzy and Millie was the one that somehow crossed over because, again, like Synfest, big Calvin Hobbes influence. It was about a little wolf boy who was very philosophical. And when I say wolf boy, like a little anthropomorphic wolf boy, very philosophical, and a little fox girl who was wild and rambunctious. So you can already see the kind of Calvin Hobbes influence.
Yeah,
there.
I have just opened it in a tab on the computer that's doing the recording, and yeah, it is like similarly to Synfest. It's taken the lesson of like really clean, really tidy art. You can, because it's a furry thing, like there's a specific, I guess, cartoon heritage to furry art in particular. And so it does that instead of the more Calvin and Hobbesy style, but also like leaves out unnecessary stuff. So the strip I'm looking at, which is entirely random, is like two characters having an argument with the punchline being that the argument is dumb, but there's no backgrounds or anything like that to clutter things up. There's just a little bit of a hint of a shadow to show that they're standing on something, you know?
Yeah, exactly. You can see again that the author of Ozzy and Millie, Dana Simpson, also studied the comic art, understood how to craft the newspaper style. And interesting thing about the two of them, because we were all like, one of those two is going to be the big one. As we know, Tetsuya Ishida of Synfest is still on the internet plugging away. His comic derailed and is now, if like in the last 5 years, went full turf, and in the last few months now is basically saying it's all great replacement shit, and he's basically saying, you know what, we really, you know, Hitler really had some good ideas. So did not turn out the way he wanted it to. Dana Simpson, however, actually did successfully get a syndicated newspaper comic. She is now the author of Phoebe and Her Unicorn, which is very big with the kids right now. So we all see how. So basically, what I'm saying is, we all saw how that I won't say grudge match turned out, because I don't think either of these cartoonists are really associated in any way with each other. I don't know if they've ever met, but you know, one's done well. One did well for herself. The other became a Nazi. So draw your own conclusions.
And like incredibly kind of the thing that you documented along with becoming a Nazi is he became incomprehensible. Like if you don't already understand what he's talking about, his strips now make not the slightest bit of sense. Sometimes they have kind of conspiracy talking points, but I actually went to his website for this so I could go back and check the date of the first episode, and the current strip is something about like ants being menaced by a lawnmower that's being pushed by a pawn, I think, from a chess set. It's kind of an Alice in Wonderland vibe, but I don't know why there are the two scales of stories going on or what the point of that strip is. Like the ants hear a loudspeaker, so maybe there's like a social control metaphor there. But like it's completely incomprehensible. It doesn't make the slightest bit of sense.
Yeah, he has become so Tetsuya Ishida has over the years become so embroiled in like QAnon and very esoteric internet conspiracies that like now if you try to read Synfest, there's no entry point, it is incomprehensible. I did a deep dive where I read the entirety of 24 years of Synfest, and I could barely follow it, but like, you know, from the beginning I can kind of parse out most of it. It is absolutely, it's kind of a horror vacui thing where he gradually abandoned everything that he had learned about how to construct a comic, like, you know, the what would you call it, the conciseness of the form, and now it's just become kind of a chicken fat sort of just an amalgamation of every single bugaboo that he has needs to be present in every single panel of every single strip. So and you'll notice, I mean, he's not the only one. A lot of cartoonists who get very fired up about politics will do this sort of thing. It does seem to be much more a problem on the right wing side, where they just kind of become incomprehensible and just shove everything they want in there. I have seen it in comic strips, like if you pick up your local if you go down to the street corner where your local anarchist is handing out your mimeographed zine, you'll find very often that their comics also get very like top heavy. But I've never seen anything quite like Tetsuya Ishida, because I've never seen anyone quite radicalized in the same way, where it goes from fairly like progressive. He starts out as kind of dude bro, nominally progressive in the sense of like libertarian free speech and like, hey, we make fun of everyone equally, but everyone should have rights. And now he's gotten to the point where he's like, we need to kill all the Jews because trans people are a conspiracy by Jews to destroy Western birth rates. It is just like, and it's basically what your Facebook uncle is posting most of the time. So, and he's only like, Tetsuya Ishida is my age. He's like a Gen Xer, so he has no excuse for. Well, actually, wait, Gen Xers are actually probably the worst though. we suck. We're the worst generation.
I guess. I mean, you get like the tendency to curdle into conservatism as people age. It'll be interesting. So I'm I suppose technically a Xennial. I'm an 81 baby, so I'm like right on the edge of what you could call millennial versus Gen X. But you get like the not caring about shit is a virtue combined with the curdling into conservatism thing. That does seem like it would be like uniquely toxic. I want to pick up on something that you just mentioned, because it's actually a thing that I hadn't thought of, but you reminded me of, which is that like prior to this kind of explosion on the internet, I was actually either buying or finding lying around in people's flats, like shared houses. Is flat a term you use in America?
We call them apartments.
Right, okay. Like in New Zealand, an apartment is like a thing that's part of like a larger building, and a flat is when you live in a standard house, but it's for rent, basically.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. Yeah, we just call them houses then.
Right.
Or rentals, okay. I guess, usually. Yeah.
Okay. So, like, I was both buying and finding. I guess they were like effectively zines, but not in the zine format, but like little A5 format comic strips that people were making and producing in my hometown. Now, I don't live there anymore, so I don't know. I haven't like done the research to find out if there was a scene like that in the town where I live now. But it seems like in the late 90s, just prior to everyone doing this on the internet, at least here in New Zealand, there was this really fertile, quite weird, like super micro comic scene that was happening. So I hadn't thought about that, but I wonder if that was actually like a precursor to people going, hey, I could scan this and stick this on the internet.
I definitely think so, because I remember the same thing. It's like in the 90s, when I was younger, you would find like any convention you'd go to, any sort of even local events, there would be people, who were basically Xeroxing, and stapling together little comic books. And, sometimes they'd leave them on street corners. You'd find them in like phone booths and stuff. And,
they used to be they used to be in cafes in the town where I used to live is called Dunedin, which is a different way of saying Edinburgh. But there was a big kind of cafe scene because it's a student city, like about, I don't know, 30% of the population is students who rotate out every year because the university is there. So there's a big kind of student cafe scene. And so they would be in cafes, and there was like a weekly what's going on this week thing, which was called Fink, which was like one A5 page folded down as small as you could fold it. And then you could fold it out again. And it would have like, here's what's going on at all of the various bars and all that stuff. But also they would devote like the other side of it to a comic from somebody. And they were just like wildly experimental and strange,
Yeah. Like that was the thing is like it was before the internet. It was a little harder to find an audience, but like they were so comics would pop up in weird places. You would have them. I remember like parts of like bands would be putting on shows, and half the time flyers would be like done by indie comic guys locally, or you'd have just like zines and things like that. College newspapers. I mean, because in those days it was like if you wanted to be like a real cartoonist, college newspapers was a big thing. And then as soon as the internet came along and you could get it on the internet, it was like, wait a second, I don't need to just have like 5 guys at a cafe reading this. The whole world can see this. And I think we all in the year 2000 had this fantasy from reading, if you ever read Ender's Game, where Ender's older brother is like, I'll start a blog, and then everyone in America and everyone's like, that guy who wrote that blog is good. He should be the ruler of the world. And all the cartoonists kind of thought we'd like, oh yeah, I'm going to put on the internet and I will be discovered because I'm so good. Everyone's going to come to this, my GeoCities page and go from there.
I mean, talk about lost eras in web design, man. Like it was horrible, but I do find myself nostalgic for GeoCities from time to time. And there's something about like big swings taken by very passionate, very amateur web designers,
I mean, again, it's like, it's the same way that you kind of miss that public access aesthetic of the 80s and 90s, where the same thing with this early web design. You're seeing people who don't necessarily know what they're doing and their passion outstrips their abilities, but there is something magical about that. And I think, not to shit on today's cartoonists on the web, but it has become so professionalized. I mean, you're not going to get like, you do not see the same sorts of talented, talented amateurs it used to. Now everything has to be so polished and complete and perfect if you want to get any traction at all. And I feel like we have lost a little something that way, which is unfortunate.
Absolutely. I mean, I think my other thing that I do outside of podcasting, I used to do lots of tabletop role-playing stuff, and it was a choice between doing that or being in bands, and I picked being in bands. But like, this is another kind of Dunedin story, but when I lived there were lots of bands who got gigs, like sometimes in people's living rooms, who were dire, who were just awful. But you have to have that space. Like, you have to have the tier where you have maybe some audience or some chance for people to find you, and you still suck, so that you can then use that as a basis to get good. Most people do not like start putting professional quality work out on the internet. I went and found, because there are some strips that are still going, questionable content. I don't know if you ever got into it. Sort of
wow.
It's now a romantic slice of life strip with androids. But it started back in like 2004, and the art quality difference is stark. Like if you go back to the first strip, it is rough. But because the standard of skill was so diverse, like Jeff Jacks was able to keep that going long enough that he could get good.
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the nice things about webcomics, because they go on indefinitely. So you do see a lot of web cartoonists like improve by leaps and bounds as they really, they start out just doing this maybe for fun, and eventually kind of as they find their passion, improve not only in art but also in joke telling. We see a lot of comics also do this thing where they decide they start out as gag comics, and at a certain point the author kind of feels like they kind of bristle against the constraints of that. They want to tell longer, more involved stories, and you will see the comics kind of gradually mutate into very extravagant epic storylines, which sometimes are really interesting, and other ones kind of don't make that leap as much. It's a mixed bag.
Yeah, it's like, I guess the connection I would make is to like, because absolutely I saw that trend, and you can kind of like, if you go back and read the archives of these comics, you can kind of sense when it's coming. That they're like, all right, we're going to gear up, we're going to do the thing.
Yeah.
But I would compare it to what happened with the internet, the YouTube criticism boom. You know, that guy with the glasses crowd had that thing where they all started out essentially trying to copy the angry video game nerd, but for different things other than video games. But then they started getting plots and crossovers and elaborate costumes, and the final form of that evolution feels to me like the people on YouTube who are doing here's 3 hours of explaining an abstruse piece of philosophy quite well, but I'm going to do it in a series of complicated sets with very elaborate costumes, hyper specific lighting. I'm talking about Philosophy Tube and ContraPoints specifically,
right?
Both of whom I like, but they're both people who started basically talking straight to camera, then coincidentally, I think transitioned, and now do these epics with sets and lighting and side characters and this, sometimes played by themselves, so they're talking to themselves. It's a whole thing, but it seems to me like the same impulse, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I think with webcom, the same ideas, you want to grow and expand and do more. And I think that's a very natural artistic impulse. And you will notice, and I think the best artists are always pushing themselves to kind of refine and expand what they're doing. You will see some artists, of course, who are hey, I got a good gig here. I'm just going to stagnate and do the same thing forever. I mean, that's a thing that you see a lot in regular comics in the newspaper. Not going to name any names on that one. Web comics, I think, were interesting because they all started, I would say, there are basically 3 or 4 basic kinds of webcomics in the 2000s, which eventually, as the artists kind of grew and expanded, became almost in this tree of life into so many different epic, expanded, and weird things. But they all started back in 2000. You had furry webcomics, which were, basically oh, what if a fox was sexy, you know?
Oh, and I think it's fair to say that there is an entire furry media ecosystem, which is kind of its own thing and kind of always has been since it started being a thing.
Absolutely. It is its own thing. And in the year, I think I mentioned this earlier, in 2000, furry webcomics were entirely separate. You would see other webcomic crossovers all the time because all these cartoonists were trying to get more attention. So they're making friends, making alliances, having crossovers. The furry ones hung out with the furries. They did not do it with anyone else. That was a time when, of course, being a furry was bad. It was considered, that was what the internet looked down on. We've moved past that now, but in the year 2000, furry was definitely kind of its own cesspool.
Yeah,
but furry webcomics were huge.
There was there was that whole cohort of people who only knew about furries because there was that one CSI episode.
That's right. Oh my God, I remember that. And and of course, being a furry back in those days, I remember seeing that, and I was oh no, oh my God. I was all no, actually, they got it extremely wrong. But but of course, but then everyone's how do you know that? And I was I don't know, Copper. But but there were lots of furry webcomics, and they continue. I'm trying to think of, I mentioned Ozymandias being a big one. There was oh my God, what else was there? Sabrina Online, which about what if a skunk was sexy, and also loved Transformers and had a computer. And that was a great early aughts internet because it was about the internet. So it was this hot skunk girl who's I'm going to send an email. And everyone reading it could be I know what email is. Oh, what a laugh. And I think that comic actually may still be going to this day, untouched by time, like a bug preserved in amber. So furry webcomics, one of the big ones back then. But the other ones, there were also kind of pixel webcomics. And that was where you just took characters from a video game and you had them swear at each other. So it was kind of oh, what if Mario said fuck? That was a big kind of webcomic back then. Then there was a slice of life webcomic, which is basically I'm a college kid. Here's my webcomic that was originally supposed to be the college paper but got rejected, so now it's online. So, it's basically about like, this is me. This is my wacky roommate. This is the sarcastic hot goth girl from across the hallway. We're going to basically have a slice of life thing. And that would continue until the writer decided this is boring. What if I put robots in there? And also, Cthulhu appeared for some reason, which was a big thing.
To his credit, Jeff Jacks had the talking robot right back in the first strip. So like the first gag in questionable content is, what if the machine that you used to download porn had a personality and could talk to you? Wouldn't that be awkward?
Oh, that is actually that would be very awkward. So that's actually a good gag. Yeah, that's right. Because that actually reminds me, because another kind of webcomic was the gamer webcomic, where it was basically about playing video games, and that crossed over with Pixel ones a lot. But the big one for that was, there was Penny Arcade, of course, which continues to this day and is probably still the standard bearer for that. And then 180 degrees diopposed, you'd get Control-Alt-Delete, which is kind of been the whipping boy of the web for like 100 years now, because it had that. Oh my God! Everyone still remembers Lost.
Oh yeah, shit. I genuinely love the fact that loss can be reduced to something that looks like a witch mark. Like just the cross with the lines coming off it. And if you know, you know. But you could if you were making an occult horror movie and you felt like putting an Easter egg in just to freak out the people who know, you could plausibly scroll the loss glyph along with all of your other witch marks on a wall, and it wouldn't look out of place.
It is pretty amazing how that has become such a so iconic in its own way. Tim Buckley of Control-Delete is kind of famous for just being a shit in general for some time immemorial, and I believe like a sex pest, but maybe I shouldn't say that because I don't have the proof right in front of me. I may be wrong. I don't know.
I think like. I want to be careful as well. I think the likelihood of being sued for this is very, very minimal. But I think like it's fair to say that there were rumors of sex pestery. I think that's pretty well established. I would have to go and do more research than I want to do to determine the veracity of those rumors. But it was certainly a thing that went around, was that he was being inappropriate with like underage fans or something like that.
I think that sounds familiar to me. Tim Buckley, though, what I think is the thing about him that is most interesting to me is that he is an example of one of those comics that starts out gag a day, goofy video game jokes, and he decided, I'm going to get serious. And then he had this plot line where the main character, who is this kind of idiot man-child,
who is a stand-in for him specifically as well.
Yeah. Yes. And I will say credit to Buckley where it's due. The version of himself in the webcomic is less irritating than the version of himself in the web cartoon series that came out later on. I can't recommend the cartoon series. It's dire. But I'm not sure if I forget. But then the girl miscarried in the comic strip, and that's where we get Lost. And I don't know whether he had always planned on like that to be the ultimate outcome of that storyline, or he just realized introducing a baby would be really make it harder to write wacky video game jokes. And he was like, what if we just got rid of the baby? Then, we're fine. I don't know, but either way, I don't think he planned. I do not think the comic Lost, since it's done in pantomime, obviously was supposed to hit really hard in the emotions. And it seems like it did not, because nobody takes that. Even the day that it was posted, I think people were already like mocking it. So did not work out as he thought it would.
No, it's such a disconnect from the rest of the tone of the comic. And also Tim Buckley, I think even his fans would probably agree that his art did not improve in the way that many other, like, it didn't start as bad as a lot of webcomic artists did, but it also didn't progress from where it started. So the comic is a wordless comic about a guy rushing into a hospital and discovering that his partner has miscarried, and the characters look incredibly flat, and the emotions on their faces read quite awkwardly. So it's very mawkish and strange if you were going to take it seriously, and so the tendency is not to.
Yeah, it's I mean, I think also like Buckley just had so much baggage by that point. It's just being kind of, being the penny arcade but bad of the internet. So I don't think he could have made that leap into serious storytelling anyway, but didn't work. But yeah, so those are some of the okay. And I also another very important early kind of webcomic that we had back in those days, and I don't know that we have this as much anymore, but it's this genre of webcomic which is basically like, what if by a wacky series of coincidences, which may involve, nuclear waste, or it may involve like a ditzy genie, it may involve whatever, but what if you got turned into a girl? What if you were a girl? This is huge. Mm-hmm. Like about half of webcomics were about this plot, and it would be like, about like, oh darn, I'm a girl, I guess I got to do girl things now. And there were a lot of webcomics like this. And
it's like the chart of like the incidence of left-handedness over time. Gosh, where did all of these trans people come from? We never used to have so many of them. And then you look at the pop culture that was coming out of unsupervised teenagers in the immediate lead up to the sudden explosion of people identifying publicly as trans, and you go, gosh.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing it's just interesting that when there were a lot of people who were, when given access to a medium that allowed them to express themselves creatively in a way in front of an audience that they wouldn't have before, and no barriers, no one telling you what you should put in there. They chose this particular topic, and we had their comics like The Watch, El Guna Shive, Venus Envy. I think there were. I
read one for a while, which I dropped because it was sort of like attempting to be manga and not very good from memory. It was called Misfiled.
Yes, Misfiled. I forgot all about that one.
Yeah, it was like there was a filing error in heaven, and so the guy woke up as a girl, I think. I cannot be bothered going back and checking on Misfiled, but it was that literal thing.
Yeah, I remember that one. There were so many of these that I had a friend at the time who was doing their senior thesis on gender transformation in webcomics. Like they actually cataloged and categorized like all these. They were like 50 different webcomics they were going through. I assumed that they got their PhD by this point. I actually don't know, but there were a lot of them. And that's why, I was saying this the other day with webcomics, if you were doing a webcomic in the year 2000, it's like you're either Tetsuya Ishida or congratulations on your transition. And there are a lot of webcomics cartoonists who are active in that era who didn't even necessarily do comics about gender transformation, but who have since transitioned or come out as some form of trans or non-binary or queer. And that's great. I mean, it actually is very nice because in those days, in the year 2000, of course, we didn't have the language for a lot of these things. So people were trying to explore things they didn't necessarily know what to do, especially because in those days, if you didn't have a local queer community, and most people would not necessarily live in a place where they did, you didn't have any way of finding this stuff out. So it was only through the internet that you might make these connections. So anyway, so that might explain why it's a particular distinct genre of webcomic. Now, actually, because now that's the thing, I wonder, because it is not something that necessarily requires being explored through this like venue, because now it's very out in the open. Everyone knows what a lot more about gender and stuff. So I think it seems like we have fewer webcomics coming from that. Also, the fact that I guess it might be like kind of tacky to be like, just start out with like, oh, here's a wacky gender transformation comic. Isn't it hot? And it's like, oh, well, it's a little goat.
And this is an entirely unprofessional observation. My observation is that there are fewer webcomics about people being magically gender transformed and actually being kind of into it, and way more one-person team indie video games where this character is just straightforward canonically trans. Like, that seems to be where that energy has gone instead. Now, we are overdue for a halfway break, so we're going to do that now, and we will be back right after this, because I have, I think, a secret fifth category that I want to run by you and see if you agree with, but we'll see. Ooh. Anyway, we'll be back right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
You're listening to Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast produced for Manawatu People's Radio Te Reo Irarangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu with the support of New Zealand On Air, so cheers for that, guys. I am talking this evening to Bitter Karella, internet personality and cursed Sinfest Noah, about the massive explosion of creativity in webcomics that came out of the early 2000s. And you were talking about like sort of taxonomizing them into four broad categories, which were like slice of life things, gamer comics, wouldn't it be funny if I was a girl, tee-hee, oh, but maybe really, and the fourth one that I've just forgotten.
Was it pixels?
Yeah. Repurposing pixel art from video games so that Mario can say fuck. There is also the category of like strange art projects, which like I don't think that they were ever as big, which is perhaps why it slips outside the taxonomy. But there were like, you would come across things which would be like entirely serious, or maybe they would be humor comics, but the humor would be very strange, and the art style would be in keeping with that. So I remember it's now only accessible through archive.org, I think, but there was a comic by an artist called Dead Mouse called Ballad, which was about a dead boy who is reanimated by having something put inside his head, which is like sewn shut. And then he has these like very strange dreamlike adventures where people are mean to him. There was another one called Rice Boy, which was like an adventure webcomic where the art was very strange and stylized. And that Rice Boy isn't still going, but the artist behind that, Evan Dahm, has continued to make things on that website. And his art keeps getting better, but stays very unearthly and abstract, which is fascinating to see. There was Akewood, which was like a humor strip, but all of the characters were like not anthropomorphic animals, just animals that kind of moved like people. And it has a kind of like syntax and grammar which will just seep into your brain and warp your speech patterns if you read it for a while. Anyway, like I remember there being a lesson is learned, but the damage is irreversible.
Oh my God! Wow! Whoa! I'm just gonna crumbling into dust till I hear that, like the Crypt Keeper. Oh my God, that one! I remember that one.
Yeah. Which like that is literally what it says on the tin. Each strip, a lesson is learned, but the damage is irreversible. But also, like, they're incredibly strange and metaphysical, and the strips are like, they look oil painted almost. Like, there was some really strange, complementary, strange stuff getting made at the same time.
Yeah, no, you're right. A lot of them, when I think back on it, there were a lot of strips that were, for lack of a better term, kind of like this art house Dada style, where it was like, it seemed like these were the ones that came most directly from zine culture, and like literally just taking weird things that would have been on paper and put on the internet. Perry Bible Fellowship started around that time, which is like I think is restarted. It's kind of sporadic from what I understand, but it's
I see it
which has
get reposted on social media every so often. Like I don't follow it, but I see the strips crop ups, which makes me feel like there are new ones.
Yeah, I know there have been some new ones since its big kind of ground to a halt at some point in the mid I think the early teens, and there have been some. I don't know how regular they come, but that one, which is the has amazing different art styles which change depending on the needs of the individual comic strip for that gag, and also very dark writing, which you see in a lot of these early comics, because some of the ones, I think, like The Parking Lot is Full was another one that got very dark. Chopping Block was one that was also kind of like that. It was about a serial killer. It was very dark and done with like weird like sponge paint, so it had this almost like watercolor look to it. But yeah, there were a lot of these that felt like they were originally created as art projects, then just went on to be comics. And I remember there was one which was less dark. It was, but it was very obvious, like it was an art project. It was called When I Am King, and it was basically like completely created like on computers, like an Egyptian king doing stuff. But like the strips would be like, oh, they did weird stuff because it's like, we're on a computer, we're gonna add animations in it. We're gonna have some strips be like 5 yards long, some are gonna be vertical, some are horizontal. We're doing all this wacky stuff just to take advantage of the new medium of the internet as a sort of an interactive art project. And Scott McCloud like absolutely like shit his pants when he saw that, because he was like so excited about this, seeing someone push the bounds of the new media, I guess. Scott McCloud, I shouldn't spag on him. He's an awesome guy.
No, he seems to be like an entirely blameless, like, I don't know how necessarily locked in with things he is anymore, but his book, Understanding Comics, is genuinely a pretty good way to understand at least the history of comics.
Yeah, no, he's got like, I mean, yeah, I think Understanding Comics is definitely like one of the ur texts. It really is very useful for understanding comics. And he personally is probably the world's second most patient man after Neil Gaiman, considering how often people ask him inane questions online. But yeah, he was a big booster for some of these early wacky webcomics because, I think he was one of the first people he was talking about the infinite canvas and the idea that like you're no longer, because that is the thing. A lot of early webcomics were obviously modeled on newspaper comics, and the writers were aping that form. And Scott McCloud was an early guy to say like, you don't have to. You can do anything you want. It's the internet. And and I think over time we've kind of adjusted to what works on the internet, because obviously the internet of today is very different from the internet of 2000. And if you're making a webcomic today, you have to kind of make it so that it can be viewed on like Instagram or Tumblr or whatever, and you build it to those specifications. But it is what it is.
I mean, you talking about Instagram and Tumblr raises a point, which is I do think that like this explosion of creativity, because I do genuinely think it was like groundbreaking in a lot of ways, and a massive democratization of the means of making art in a real way, could in some ways only have happened in that phase of the internet's development. Like, I have the very limited distinction of having briefly been at the same university with and knowing personally the guy that Cory Doctorow quotes as saying the internet is now 4 websites, each composed of quotes from the other 3. That's a guy called Tom Eastman, who's based in Wellington, I think. Is a clever internet person. But like, that is true. That is what the internet is nowadays. And I don't like you say, there are webcomics that are significantly more professional than anything that came out of this period. But I don't think you could have a scrappy poorly drawn, inventive but very strange comic succeed in the same way that a lot of them did in the like walled garden by walled garden, many of which you're viewing through an app on your phone environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like today, it's a very different thing because, you are, like in the old days, if you had a webcomic, you had your own site. People would go to that site to read your webcomic. Those were people who liked what you did. They were genuine fans. They would often, you would have pages of links to find other webcomics. There was kind of that vibe. Nowadays, everyone's on like 4 websites. So, and they're scrolling through, and if you have a comic, it might go through their feed. They might hit like, and then they'll scroll on. And it's like the chances of them actually deciding, I like that comic enough to see what else this guy has done, very small, if even they understand that a person created that comic, because nowadays more and more people are so disassociating the artist from the art, and everything is now content, that I speak to people all the time who don't seem to understand that, a cartoonist drew that cartoon. It did not sprout fully formed from like the forehead of Zeus or something. There's a labor of love that a person made. And, back in the 2000s or the early 2000s, we had something like Keen Space, which I believe still exists at this point, but is completely irrelevant for comic things. Nobody goes to comic pages anymore. Keen Space, for those of you who, basically what it was, Keen Spot was a site for comics. You got like, if you were selected to be on Keen Spot, you were like the creme de la creme of webcomics in those days. I think the comics we got like, I think Ozzy and Millie was a Keen Space comic. Most of the big ones were. I think Chopping Block was as well. I think The Parking Lot is Full maybe was. A Lesson is Learned but The Damage is Permanent might have been one as well. I can't remember, but there were a lot of these were the creme de la creme. And Keen Spot then opened Keen Space, which was the idea that like, this is where anyone can start a webcomic. And so if you went to Keen Space and you clicked on the list of webcomics, you get like literally a list like of 5,000 webcomics alphabetically that you could go through and read them all. And when I was younger, I actually thought, I'm going to do that. And which did not, I gave up almost immediately. But shout out to Tailsteak, who is the smartest man in the world, for naming his comic 1/0, so that it was always the very first on the list. And that was a webcomic that like Scott McCloud, I'm sure, would have loved if he hasn't seen it, because it was all about the meta creation of a webcomic. And it's a good one. I still actually think it's one of the better ones of that era. But the point is, there were like a million of these webcomics. Everyone's starting it. Most of them have like 2 or 3 strips before the artist like either was like, okay, I can't draw anymore because I have my final exams coming up, or they did the other thing, which was, hey, nobody has left me any comments in my guest book. If you don't do that, I'm going to quit. And then they quit. Because
you mentioned Scott McCloud being excited about the potential of comics, and I do think like we're coming up on time. But there is a last thing that I want to think about quickly, because I do remember. I can't remember what it was called. I think it was like a kung fu thing that I read for a little bit, but it did have like motion panels and like weird layouts would swerve in strange directions and things like that. And that did seem to me like it was like an exciting direction to take comics in, but it was entirely dependent on Flash. I guess the most famous example of that is Homestuck, which no one has time to approach Homestuck. It is far too big and strange. But like Homestuck was a thing that started, I think, as like a Flash game and then turned into a comic. And then the comic started having elements of animation and music and video sequences and stuff. But all of it was integrated into the comic because that was a way that you could work in Flash, which was a bit of animation software, which now no longer exists.
Yeah, there are a lot of webcomics that are now just a broken link. Flash disappeared, and it took with it almost like, again, it's like the Great Forgetting, because I remember watching stuff like, God, I think all the old Icebox tunes were Flash. So things like Mr. Wong and Queer Duck and Hard Drinkin' Lincoln. I'm not recommending any of these, by the way, but I'm just saying that I believe they were early Flash things that you can't see anymore, unless they've been mirrored on YouTube, which is possible. But yeah, the original versions of these are kind of lost to the ages. Unfortunately.
Yeah, a better known example, in the sense that it permanently damaged the speech patterns of a generation of internet users and has memes that are still live today, would be, and we're digressing briefly into talking about cartoons rather than comics, but Homestar Runner.
Yeah, I knew you were gonna. I knew it.
Homestar Runner, if people don't know about it, was this website that started out, I think, to be like a children's book or something, but it exploded into this series of it was like a shared universe of linked animations and video games and things. But because it was Flash, which was designed for animation, but also for the animation to be interactive, so you could use it to make games. The cartoons would have like elements you could click on and it would do something, or open up a text box, or do something else, or take you to a link. And that's something that straightforward video simply cannot do. So you do have the Homestar Runner videos, I believe, uploaded as videos to YouTube, but they're now only videos. You can't interact with any of the stuff that would have been interactive elements at the time.
Yeah, they felt like those old educational CD-ROM games, which we've really, and I remember Homestar Runner when it really started being a thing, I think around the year 2001, 2002. One day I was walking around my town and I saw a person wearing a Homestar Runner shirt. I think it was the cheat. And I remember at that time thinking, this is the first time I've ever seen the internet break containment. This is a turning point. Things are never going to be the same again.
Yep.
And lo and behold, look what the world we live in now.
I saw a pickup truck literally this weekend with a new looking Trogdor the Burninator sticker on the back of it. So people are still, and it looked like a pickup truck that people actually got mud on. So the sticker would have aged.
Wow.
So, people are buying new Homestar Runner merch in the year of our Lord 2024 and putting it on their cars.
I mean, I guess the nice thing about that is you could say that, like, as bad as tough as it is out there for artists and creators, and it is tough and always getting tougher, it is nice to see that a lot of these things that are quality do have staying power. They endure, and Homestar Runner is still very beloved because it is very funny and very well written and very entertaining, and that's something that can endure.
Yeah, and it had the knack, and I think the best of this stuff does of the jokes. The jokes that work are the ones which are not dependent on so much on the pop culture landscape of the day. Homestar Runner does make pop culture jokes, but it makes jokes about like the kinds of computers that the creators of Homestar Runner would have used in school classrooms when they were very first at school. And so like very old computer is bad is a joke that anyone can get. And the rest of the humor is all so much its own thing that it kind of doesn't age, quite a lot of it.
There is a surreal, timeless quality to the humor in Homestar Runner that I think, does make it endure. And I mean, I've seen it. There are other comics and cartoons that do that. I think that, what is that show? I think actually the Homestar Runner guys worked on it. Gravity Falls, I noticed, does that a lot as well. Yeah, it's got that sense where you understand these things are references to actual things that exist in a particular time period, but they are tweaked enough to make them feel like they work in any time period. And I think there's the Brothers Chap or Brothers
Chaps, I think. Chaps.
Yeah, yeah. I think they worked on that show to some degree. Is so that might explain it. Um, but I mean, like that's true for all good art. I think that it endures.
Yeah, I think so. Well, look, we are coming up on time. Thank you very much for talking to me today, Karella. This has been a lot of fun. I like to do two things by way of wrapping up the show. The first is to ask if you have any specific recommendations, like are there webcomics you still follow? Are there things in that space that you think are interesting? Are there new webcomics that are doing interesting things that you think are worth checking out?
Oh my God. So I have not been keeping up with webcomics lately. I can give you some recommendations for the ones back in the day, and these may or may not exist. So let me quickly go through them. Some of my favorites, Between Failures. I think it's still going. That's a great slice of life comic. It's very much in the vein of early Jeff Jakes. I believe it's done by Jackie Wollenhouse does Between Failures. Steph Cherrywell did a comic called Intragalactic, which was a great spoof of sort of space opera, which I don't think they're doing it anymore. I think they've retired. God, what else? There was let's see. There was Newshounds by Thomas K. Dye, which is another very early one from the early 2000s. He was doing kind of taking the furry animal thing, these furry animals, they live in a people world, and trying to kind of take that to its logical conclusion, which becomes very strange and very surreal, especially as he moves into a new project kind of in the same universe called Projection Edge, which takes that and turns it into very ponderous 70s progressive science fiction. So very strange, very interesting stuff. Let's see. But the comic that I can think of that I love more than anything, and unfortunately, if anyone can find this one, let me know, because it vanished from the internet. It was called Ein Stück Natur. And this was a comic where literally the person just took random clip art and had them talking to each other, very much like dinosaur comics, which I think may still be around, although not the same thing every way. And then they just decided to start putting in trying to make it sound like it was German philosophy. And it became a very weird, surreal, Dada comic, mostly about a polygonal man exploring an infinite universe of nothing, just a featureless void, and then randomly would have other things there was a dog named Guitar George and a giant cockroach. Anyway, it sounds very dumb when I describe it. It probably was, but I remember it being the webcomic that I followed religiously back in the years of the Bush years. And at some point, whoever made it just decided to take it off the internet, because you could still do that back then. Let's see, my old Keen Space comics are still up too. Surprisingly, I forgot my password, so I can't delete them, much to my eternal shame. I won't say the names because I don't actually want people to go read those, though, because they really suck. They're so bad. It was 2000, so I was trying to be very edgy. It was like, look at me. Oh, I'm a real badass. It was
late 90s, 2000s Edge is its own very, very special thing. I would recommend, in terms of things that are still going, if you like light, queer-friendly stuff, Questionable Content is still going and has now turned into a queer-friendly romantic sitcom, and does interesting things with thinking about gender and body dysphoria stuff. They have humans who do that, but they also have AIs that get decanted into bodies and have to deal with whether their body is the kind that they want or not. And it's more interesting than it has any right to be. The reservation there is that it started as a very 2000s slice of life thing with isn't this a wacky idea? And also, why I'm so sad about unrequited love. But I think it sticks the transition into trying to be more serious. It sticks the landing on that better than a lot. In in terms of things that are like dead and gone, I do think everyone should at least try Akewood, but Akewood is Marmite, if you're familiar with Marmite.
I get it. Yes.
Yeah, like it is either going to be your thing or so badly not your thing that you're going to bounce straight off, but you will bounce off almost immediately, I think. So it's not going to be like a time commitment that you've wasted. It does kind of tail off because the guy's life just got too complicated to keep making it. But there are a couple of big plot lines in Akewood that I do think still stand up. And in terms of new things, there is a completed comic called On a Sunbeam, which is about a group of women in the far future where there are no men for reasons that are never explained and you have no reason to know, doing maintenance work on ruins in space that they navigate in a ship that looks like one of those ornamental goldfish with the like super flowy tails and fins. Again, never explained. You don't need to know why it's happening. It's just kind of gorgeous. There's a comic called Stand Still, Stay Silent, which is now completed about people in Scandinavia in the far future, in a post-apocalypse where the post-apocalypse thing is everyone got a virus that turned them into things called trolls, which are like ambulatory rot piles in the shape of whatever they were before they died and rotted. And also magic works now, but in a very kind of odd and shamanistic way. And it's kind of fascinating. And like Kill 6 Billion Demons is the...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's like kung fu philosophy in the multiverse full of demons, and the art is just kind of mind-destroyingly good. It's really cool.
That is a very good one.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, one last one I just thought of. Okay, so if you liked hearing about the year 2000 and webcomics in like the year 2000, 2001, that era, and you want to experience it for yourself, there's still a way to do it. Go and check out Sluggy Freelance. It is the first webcomic.
Goodness, it is still going. Good God.
Untouched by time. Untouched. Exactly the same as it was in the year 2000. It is, again, like a bug in amber. So anyway, I just had to put that out there as well.
No, that is an excellent point, and well worth checking out. Like, if you want deep, insane cuts, Mega Tokyo, which we didn't have time to talk about, but is like just pure early 2000s weeb stuff, is still going for some reason.
Wow.
And you can hunt around and find other things from those places if you want to. But as Karella and I both said at the start, like, this, there is a deep seam of absolute garbage that the gems shine out of, you know. So if you really go and explore the annals of early 2000s webcomics, you're going to read a lot of dreck. Finally, Karella, thank you so much for doing this. Do you have things, not your early comics, that you want people to actually find? I would recommend people go look up House of Decline, that's spelled Haus, like the German house, and find, if you've enjoyed this conversation and you want to know more about Sinfest in specific, Karella did an episode of the House of Decline podcast about that, which is kind of heartbreaking because of some of the conclusions that you guys end up sort of coming to about Ishida and where he's at. But like, it is very interesting and quite funny. Yeah, do you have other stuff?
Sure. So I've got a few things. You can check me out on my own podcast, which is a special presentation, or Alf Will Not Be Seen Tonight, which is all about comic strips adapted into television or movies. You can also find me on Blue Sky, Instagram, Twitter, wherever fine content is, under the name Bitter Karella. And you can also check out my other project, Midnight Pals, which is both a podcast and a microfiction about what if your favorite horror writers were to gather on the campfire and tell scary stories like an Are You Afraid of the Dark? That's www.midnightpals.com. where you can access all Midnight Pals stuff.
Midnight Pals is one of those things where if you are sufficiently online, you have probably at least seen people screen capping particularly good Midnight Pals bits and sharing them on various social networks. So that's one that you probably know about if you're online enough to be listening to this. Look, thank you once again, Karella. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.